is that he never once let her know he'd heard. The champagne tasted like soap. I noticed it on the first sip, something off in the finish, a chemical note that lingered at the back of my teeth. Maybe it was the glass. Maybe it was the evening. I set the flute on the kitchen counter of whatever friend of a friend's apartment this was, and went to find something else to drink. The party was one of those mid-spring gatherings that accumulates rather than begins. People drifting in until the rooms fill, conversations layering over each other, nobody quite remembering who invited them first. Isadora moved through it easily. She always did. She had a way of occupying space at gatherings that made other people feel like they were the guests and she was the host, regardless of whose apartment it was. I watched her from across the kitchen island, the tilt of her chin when she laughed, the hand on someone's arm, the way she never fully let any single conversation own her. She was always a quarter turn away from the next one. I used to admire that. I used to think it was confidence. I poured sparkling water and decided I'd go back to the conversation I'd left in the living room. That was when I heard her voice from the hallway. Not loud. Isadora never raised her voice in public. It was the particularity of her tone I recognized, that careful lowness she used when she was saying something she genuinely meant, as opposed to something she was performing. I stopped in the kitchen doorway. The hallway was around a corner and slightly below the kitchen level, one of those older Thornfield district apartments with a half step down into the entry corridor. The acoustics bent the sound upward and funneled it. I wasn't eavesdropping in any deliberate sense. I just stopped, heard my name in her voice, and then stopped moving entirely. "Has always been my backup, Sylvie. That's not cruel, it's just practical." The voice on the other end said something I couldn't make out. "I've been building toward Conrad for years. Callum is good, he's stable, but that was never the thing. You know how it is. You keep something steady while you work on the real thing." A pause. "I'm not going to hurt him. When the time is right, I'll manage it properly. But Conrad's promotion is basically confirmed, and once he's settled into the new role..." I heard footsteps from another part of the apartment, and I moved back toward the living room before she turned the corner. I don't know how long I stood by the window after that. Long enough that someone brought me a drink I hadn't asked for. Long enough that the room got louder and the lights seemed harder to look at directly. Isadora found me around 11. "There you are," she said, touching my arm. "I've been looking." "Got stuck in a conversation," I said. She searched my face for something, a mood, a signal, the way she always did when she thought she might have done something wrong. She found nothing, apparently, because she relaxed. "Ready to go soon?" "Whenever you are," I said. I smiled because smiling was the correct response, and I'd always been good at the correct response. The drive home took 22 minutes. I know because I counted traffic lights. Isadora talked about the party. She talked about someone's new job, someone's renovated kitchen, a conversation she'd had about an exhibition opening the following month. I responded at the right intervals. I asked one or two questions. I made the turns I always made. She didn't notice anything. That was the first data point. Not the words in the hallway, those were just confirmation. The first data point was that she sat 2 feet away from me in the car and felt nothing change in the air between us. I pulled into the underground garage, and she was already texting someone as we rode the elevator up. The apartment smelled like the candle she'd lit that morning, something with sandalwood and something else I'd never been able to identify. I'd lived with that smell for 3 years and never asked what it was called. She went to wash off her makeup. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor. Backup. The word didn't hurt the way it might have if I'd been surprised by it. What it did was clarify. Like a lens that had been slightly fogged for years suddenly cleaned. Things I had cataloged, filed away under other explanations, given the benefit of the doubt, attributed to her personality, her past, her particular kind of complexity, rearranged themselves into a different pattern. The way she'd been non-committal about the mortgage. The way she lit up differently at certain names. The way her 5-year plan, whenever she talked about it, had always featured a version of her life where I was present, but never central. I had been stable, she said. I sat with that word, too. I want to be precise about what I felt that night because I think it matters. It wasn't betrayal in the acute sense, the gutting, dizzy kind that makes you sit on bathroom floors. It was more like arriving at an answer to a problem I hadn't known I was solving. The mathematics of the last 4 years suddenly produced a clean result. She had kept me. Like a hedge position. Like an option you don't exercise but hold, because holding it costs little, and letting it expire costs nothing. I understood that language. I worked in it. I was a financial analyst at Aldercroft Capital, had been for 6 years, now a senior associate on the structured products desk. I spent my working hours looking at instruments people thought they understood and finding the thing they'd missed. I was good at it. I was paid well for being good at it. And here, in my own life, I had missed the most obvious structure of all. She was not hedging against loneliness. She was hedging against timing. Conrad was the real position. I was the carry trade, paying out just enough to make the wait comfortable. I lay down in bed beside her that night, and she slept with her hands near mine, not quite touching, the way she always did. I looked at the ceiling. I began to think very carefully about what assets I held, which of them were actually mine, and what the cleanest exit would look like. I should tell you about Isadora properly, before this reads like a case file. I met her at a gallery opening, one of those events you attend because a colleague invites you and you think it'll last an hour and be fine. She was standing in front of a piece I didn't understand, describing it to someone in a way that made me want to listen without joining the conversation. She had that quality. She made things sound worth attending to. We talked for an hour that night, then 2 hours. She was an interior designer, genuinely talented, genuinely knowledgeable. She knew material, space, the psychology of how a room makes a person feel. When she came to my flat for the first time, she stood in the doorway, gave a single look around, and said, "The bookshelf is fighting with the window." She was right. She moved it without asking, and the room was immediately better. I was 31 when I met her. She was 28. We moved in together after 14 months because she lost her lease, and I offered the room, and neither of us had a strong reason to keep separate arrangements. What I remember most clearly from those early months is the particular ease of her. She had no difficulty being in a room. She had opinions about everything, paint, food, which side of the street to walk on, and she held them without aggression, which I found restful. People who have quiet authority about small things often turn out to have it about large things, too. 4 years. Not an insignificant portion of a life. What I noticed, sitting on the edge of that bed at midnight, was not that I felt nothing. I felt quite a lot. I felt the particular, specific weight of understanding that someone you'd trusted had been running a private ledger all along, and you'd never been on it. But I had learned a long time ago that feeling things and acting on feelings were entirely separable activities. You could feel a great deal and still move with precision. In fact, you often moved better when the feeling was strong, because it sharpened your attention. I filed what I felt. I thought about what to do. The next morning I went to work early. The trading floor at Aldercroft didn't truly open until 7:30, but the building was accessible from 6, and I'd always preferred that first hour before the rest of the desk arrived. The coffee from the small machine on the 14th floor was better than the main kitchen's, and the silence had a specific quality. That pre-market hum, the kind that has no content yet, only potential. I sat at my desk with a legal pad, and I wrote down every shared financial point between Isadora and me. I didn't work from memory alone. I had access to the documents. I kept a personal folder on my home laptop, a habit from work, from years of watching people get into disputes over things they'd never written down. The folder contained lease agreements, bank statements, the shared investment account we'd opened 18 months ago, and the correspondence about the interior design business she'd been planning, and that we'd discussed building together. I wrote each item in 2 columns. What was mine? What was shared? The list was longer than I'd consciously acknowledged. The apartment lease. Her name, my payment. She'd moved in after her previous place fell through, and we'd agreed I'd cover the rent while she got the business established. Her name on the lease because at the time her credit history was better for the application. My money paying it every month since. The shared investment account, funded primarily by my income, structured as jointly owned. 18 months of contributions, largely mine, under a legal arrangement that treated them as 50-50. The interior design business, Isadora's idea, Isadora's vision, but I had done the financial modeling, written the business plan structure, registered the business name, set up the company accounts. I was listed as co-director. She had the design credentials, I had the documentation. I stared at that third item for a long time. Elliot was the one person I called. We'd known each other since university. He'd studied law, ended up in commercial property, but he had a working understanding of most legal territories that I found more useful than any single specialist. He was also the kind of person who received information without reacting to it, which was precisely what I needed. We met for lunch at a place near Aldercroft that we'd been using for years, one of those basement sandwich bars that had no business being as good as it was, in a narrow street that never got much sun and was always slightly cool even in summer. He arrived exactly on time, which was one of the things I'd always relied on about him. "You look like you slept 4 hours," he said. 3, I said. He sat down. He ordered coffee. He waited. I told him what I'd heard. Not in a devastated way. I didn't perform the devastation for him because that wasn't what either of us needed. I laid it out. The party, the hallway, the words, the woman on the other end named Sylvie. The 4-year structure I'd been sitting inside without fully reading the architecture. Elliot listened without expression. "Conrad," he said when I finished. "Who is Conrad?" "Conrad Thaddeus. He runs the development division at Westmere Group. Isadora knows him through a project she consulted on 2 years ago." Elliot nodded slowly. "And you've never met him?" "Once, briefly. She introduced him as a professional contact." He turned his coffee cup in a small circle on the table. "And the business, it's registered?" "Yes, I handled the registration. My documentation, her name as creative director, me as co-director." "Whose intellectual property are the business plan documents?" I had already looked into this. "I wrote them, on my own devices, on my own time. The authorship metadata is mine throughout." "Then the first thing you do," Elliot said, "is take those documents, create a time-stamped archive, email them to yourself, use a document version history service, whatever creates an unambiguous dated record, and have your solicitor review whether the IP sits with you individually or with the company." "And if it sits with the company?" "Then the second thing you do is understand your rights as co-director. If the company hasn't traded, hasn't generated revenue, hasn't taken external investment, dissolution may be simpler than you think." He said this without relish. He said it the way he always gave information, like a man reading a bus timetable. This is where you are. This is what is available to you. The investment account, I said. Joint account. Has it been documented as unequal contribution? No. It was set up as equal ownership. He thought for a moment. Then any movement needs to be navigated carefully. You can't simply transfer your contributions back without potential legal exposure. But you can stop contributing, and you can ensure that future funds aren't going into an account she has equal access to. I can redirect my standing transfers today. Yes, you can. I looked at my coffee. The apartment lease. Whose name is it in? Hers. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Then you have a simpler situation than you think on that front. The financial obligation is hers. You've been paying voluntarily. You can stop. I need somewhere else to live. I have a flat I've been meaning to let. 3 months short let while it goes to market. Top floor of the Aldgate building, available from the 15th. I looked at him. You have a flat available. I have a flat available, he said. He returned to his coffee as though the conversation had concluded to everyone's satisfaction, which it more or less had. I want to be honest about something. Walking back to Aldercroft after lunch, I thought about whether I was making a mistake. Whether I'd misheard or taken something out of context, or was interpreting through a filter of insecurity I hadn't fully accounted for. I stood on the pavement outside the building and replayed the hallway 3 times, precisely. Her voice, the specific pitch of it, the particular flatness. She hadn't sounded guilty. She hadn't sounded conflicted. She sounded like a woman telling a friend something she'd known so long, it had become unremarkable. That was what landed. Not the content, the casualness. I'd had her books on my shelves for 3 years. I'd driven her mother to hospital twice. I'd turned down a job opportunity at the Cape Town office because she didn't want to go. I thought about that last one for a moment on the pavement, the particular quality of it. I had made a career decision, a genuinely significant one, a role that would have changed my professional trajectory, and I had made it around her. Around the stability of the arrangement. And the arrangement, it turned out, had been designated from the start as contingent. I went back inside. The next week was an exercise in compartmentalization that I have to say, retrospectively, I handled well. At home, I was the same Callum, same routines, same weight in the bed. I listened when she talked. I made coffee on the mornings it was my turn. I did not create distance. Distance would be noticed. I behaved like a man with no information, because a man with no information was the only version of me she knew how to read. At work, I had made 3 changes immediately. The first, I redirected my monthly transfer to the joint investment account. The standing order that had been sending £1,200 a month into that account was cancelled. The funds were redirected to my personal savings account, one she had no visibility of and never had. I'd maintained it separately throughout, a habit rather than a strategy at the time, but it was habit that now served me precisely. The second, I had sent myself every document I had authored relating to the interior design business. Business plan, financial projections, branding framework, market analysis, each file emailed to a time-stamped archive address, each attachment opened in a document tracking service that logged access dates. The chain of custody was mine, and it was dated, and it was clean. The third, I called the solicitor firm that handled Aldercroft's employment contracts. Not for employment advice. I used them personally for the same reason I used accountants rather than filing my own taxes. I booked an appointment with the partner who handled commercial disputes. Her name was Margaret. She had the specific, exhausted patience of someone who had heard every version of every mistake a person could make in a business partnership, and simply wanted to help you avoid adding to the list." I sat across from her and explained the business situation without the emotional context. 2 co-directors, 1 registered company, no trading history, unequal intellectual property contribution, 1 director considering dissolution. She listened, made notes, asked 2 precise questions about the registration documents. "The IP question is the interesting one," she said. "If the documents were authored by you on personal devices prior to their incorporation into company assets, there is a reasonable argument that the underlying intellectual property was licensed to the company rather than assigned to it. Whether that distinction is useful to you depends on what you want." "I want a clean separation," I said. "Then dissolution of the company and a clear IP assignment to yourself, assuming no trading history and no third-party investment, is achievable." "I'd want to review the incorporation documents, but I'd say you're looking at a fairly straightforward winding up if both directors agree." "And if one director doesn't agree?" She looked at me steadily. "Then we have a different conversation, but still a manageable one. A company with no trading history, no assets, and no revenue is not worth fighting over. Whoever holds the IP is holding the value." I left her office with a list of documents to send her, and a fee estimate that was, in the scheme of what I was protecting, negligible. The interior design business had a name. She'd chosen it, I'd registered it. Sablecroft Interiors. The company had been incorporated for 11 months. It had not traded. It had 1 bank account with £430 in it, contributed equally at setup. It had a website Isadora had designed herself, social media accounts with several hundred followers, and the complete documentation I had authored. My solicitor had reviewed the incorporation documents. Her conclusion was clear. Because the business plan, financial models, and operational frameworks had been authored before the company's incorporation, and there was no written assignment of IP from me to the company, the documents remained my intellectual property. The company had been operating on an implied license. That license could be revoked. I instructed her to draft dissolution paperwork. She also drafted, in parallel, a formal IP ownership declaration, establishing my sole authorship of the business planning materials. I signed it. She filed it. I removed my name from the company bank account as a signatory. I couldn't extract the balance without her agreement. It was a joint account, but I could remove my own authorization to transact, which I did. In doing so, I made clear to any future observer that I had no further involvement with the company's finances from that date forward. The dissolution paperwork was ready. I hadn't served it yet. Testing mattered enormously. The standing order to the investment account had been canceled for 12 days when Isadora first mentioned it. We were making dinner. She was cooking, I was dealing with the wine, and she mentioned, in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, that she'd been looking at the account statements. "I thought you were setting up an automatic transfer," she said. "I paused it," I said, "reviewing the allocation structure. The desk has been busy." She looked at me for a moment. "Okay," she said. She went back to the pan. I opened the wine. That was the entirety of it. She accepted the explanation and moved on because it was plausible and because she was not looking for problems. People who have their own private plan rarely suspect the person they've positioned as stable of having one. Conrad Thaddeus was not a mystery if you knew where to look. I spent an evening with LinkedIn, with the Westmere Group company site, with a few industry publications that had mentioned him in the context of commercial development projects. He was 38. Former corporate lawyer, moved into property development in his early 30s, rose quickly at Westmere. His most recent mention was in a trade publication announcing his promotion to head of the acquisitions division. The promotion Isadora had mentioned, now confirmed. He was, by every visible metric, successful. Well-dressed in photographs, that careful but not trying quality that people in certain industries learn to project. He had the kind of face that held authority in rooms, or at least photographed as though it would. I was not threatened by him, which I found notable. What I felt was something more like clarity about the situation's geometry. He was the position she'd been building toward. I was the carry cost. The way to remove myself from her plan was not to confront her, not to make it dramatic, not to give her the scene that might have satisfied something, but would have cost me everything in terms of precision. The way to remove myself was to quietly, methodically eliminate every single point of financial and logistical reliance she'd been building on. That she might have been building on even if she never consciously named it. Because that was the other thing. People who keep backup plans don't always do it with full self-awareness. They settle into arrangements that are convenient. They lean on the foundation they've been given. They plan their real future while assuming the ground will hold. I was the ground. I intended to move. My professional situation at Aldercroft was something I handled separately because it was the piece she had the least visibility of and the most dependence on. Over 3 years together, I had quietly and continuously been a resource to Isadora's business ambitions. When she needed to meet people in commercial property development, I had made introductions. When she was pitching for contracts at developments in the Aldercroft client portfolio, Aldercroft had a real estate investment division. I had been the reason she was in certain rooms. Not loudly, not in a way she'd ever directly asked me for. Just present, connected, vouching for her in the particular low-key way that produces results in that world. 3 of her 4 significant commissions over the past 2 years had come through connections in my network. She didn't speak about this openly, but she'd been counting on it continuing. The business plan I'd authored, the one I now owned the IP to, had included a network leverage section that explicitly mapped out how relationships in commercial development and structured investment could be used to bring the business into a higher client tier faster than organic growth would allow. Relationships she didn't have independently. I stopped making those introductions 7 weeks before I moved out. I didn't make a production of it. I simply became less available at the crossover points where her business world and mine connected. An introduction she'd been expecting me to facilitate to a project director at one of Aldercroft's development clients? I sent a vague, apologetic message about a schedule conflict and let it sit. A referral she'd asked me to arrange to a senior contact of mine who was looking for an interior designer for a large residential project? I replied that the timing wasn't right. Each of these felt like a small thing in isolation. Together, they represented the quiet severing of the pipeline she'd been planning to continue using indefinitely. There was a night about 3 weeks in when Isadora came home with flowers. I don't know why I remember this detail with the clarity I do. I was in the kitchen when she came in. She'd had a client presentation and it had gone well, and she'd bought flowers from the stall near the tube. Pale orange roses wrapped in brown paper. She set them on the counter and kissed me on the cheek and said, "It's a good day." I put them in a vase. I listened to her talk about the presentation, the client's response, the commission she'd been offered. I said the right things. I asked the right questions. And the whole time I was acutely aware that I was looking at someone who was describing the future she was building. And I was not in it. She didn't know I knew. She had no idea that the vase she was watching me fill with her flowers was in a kitchen she would soon have to furnish on her own terms, without my money, without my name on the lease payments, without my network opening its doors. I'm not going to describe that as satisfying. It wasn't, exactly. It was something quieter and more complicated. Watching someone you've known well behaving with complete ease in a situation that has already structurally ended. Like watching a play you've already read past the final page. You can see all of it. They can see only the scene. I put the flowers in the water. I closed the conversation. Elliot's flat was on the top floor of the Aldgate building, a short-let that suited my purposes in every way. I viewed it on a Wednesday afternoon during what I told Isadora was a work event, which was not untrue in any meaningful sense. Elliot met me there. 3 rooms, clean, south-facing, with a small terrace that had a view over the rooftops toward the city. Adequately furnished. The kind of place you could live in without leaving a mark on it, which was exactly what I needed for this first phase. "I'll take it from the 15th, I said. "Already assumed," Elliot said. He handed me a key and a short-let agreement drawn up by his firm. We shook hands. There was no celebration in it. It was simply a transaction between 2 people who trusted each other. I began moving things gradually. This part required patience and a particular quietness that I'm not going to pretend was comfortable. There is something disquieting about removing yourself from a shared space in increments, about standing in a room that has been part of your daily life and making careful decisions about what you are taking from it and what you are leaving behind. I started with documents, scanning everything in the apartment that had my name on it, everything I might need. Birth certificate, passport, financial statements, paper records accumulated over 3 years of shared living. I put originals in a folder in my work locker. I did this over 3 visits, while she was at client meetings or out seeing friends. I moved books next. Not all of them, just the ones that were mine and that I wanted. A box at a time, to the car, then to the Aldgate flat after work. She didn't notice. The shelves were full enough that gaps took time to register. There's a particular mercy in density. It absorbs absence. The process was methodical in a way that I found almost steadying. I was an analyst. I worked from lists. I found real satisfaction in each item moved from one column to the other. What was shared, becoming what was mine. I want to tell you about the week I ran into Conrad Thaddeus. Not that I engineered it, I didn't. But London's professional circles have a way of collapsing distance when you're paying attention, or perhaps when the situation has already made you alert to the name. A colleague's networking event at a venue near Blackwood Square, one of those early evening drinks things the firm hosted quarterly. I was already planning to attend. I saw his name on the guest list only after I'd confirmed my own. He was taller than I'd expected from photographs. The authority in rooms quality was real. I clocked it within the first minute of watching him work the space. He had a way of making whoever he was speaking to feel like the most significant person present, while the rest of the room remained subtly aware that he was there. It was a professional skill, carefully built. He didn't know who I was, which was both predictable and useful. We ended up in the same cluster near the window for about 15 minutes. He was friendly in the professional, surface-level way that people at these events are friendly. He mentioned Westmere, I mentioned Aldercroft. We discussed the commercial development landscape with the kind of generic competence that passes for interesting conversation at quarterly drinks. He didn't mention Isadora. Why would he? I was a stranger. I watched him work the room after he moved on, and I thought about what she had said. Building toward. Years of building. I thought about how entirely oblivious he probably was to having a place in someone else's private plan. He was simply a successful man at a networking event, doing what successful men do. I felt very little animosity toward him. He had done nothing. He was a destination she'd chosen. The situation wasn't his to own. I had a second drink and left early. The work piece had a second dimension I should explain. Isadora had been developing a pitch for a large-scale residential project. A developer in the Redvale district was planning a conversion of a Victorian warehouse into 12 premium apartments, and the Interior Design Commission was significant, one of the largest she'd gone for. She'd been working on the proposal for weeks, and I'd listened to her talk about it enough times to know the details as well as she did. What she didn't know was that the developer was a client of Aldercroft's structured products desk. Not my client directly, but in my firm. in my building, connected through channels I understood precisely. I sent a polite, factual note to the project coordinator. Not an interference, not a complaint, a clarification. Sablecroft Interiors was currently undergoing a directorial restructure, and any contracts considered during this period should take account of the pending change in company status. Everything I said was accurate. The company was, in fact, undergoing restructure. Dissolution is a form of restructure. Any client entering a contract with a company in that state had the right to know. The coordinator thanked me for the heads up. He said they'd wait until the company's status was clarified before proceeding. The pitch stalled. Patricia called me one afternoon in the 6th week of my quiet operation. Patricia was a colleague of Isadora's, another designer, someone she'd known for years. Over 3 years, she'd become something like an indirect friend of mine. She was straightforward in a way I found restful, and I trusted her in the limited way you trust someone you've known at one remove. "I'm going to ask you something directly," she said when I answered. "Go ahead." "Is something wrong between you and Isadora?" I sat back in my chair. "Why do you ask?" "Because she asked me last week if I thought Conrad Thaddeus was available, and then immediately said she was joking, and then wasn't on her phone for 3 days. Which is not how Isadora behaves when something is a joke." I was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you calling me," I said. "Callum?" "We're fine. I'm fine." She was silent in a way that communicated precisely how much she believed me. "Take care of yourself," she said, and rang off. I put the phone down and thought about the call for a while. I had not expected Patricia, but what her call told me was something useful. The timeline in Isadora's head was moving. The Conrad situation was not static. She was beginning to look at a horizon that didn't include me, and the people around her were starting to notice the direction of her gaze. I accelerated my own timeline by 2 weeks. The financial picture at that point looked like this. The joint investment account had received no new contributions from me for 8 weeks. The balance was approximately £47,000, of which I calculated roughly £31,000 represented my own contributions over the preceding 18 months. The account was jointly owned, legally equal, and the most complicated element of the unwinding. I had spent specific time with Margaret on this. Her advice, when stripped to its essentials, was as follows. The account was legally 50-50 regardless of contribution history, because contribution records and ownership records are not the same instrument, and we hadn't agreed otherwise in writing. However, and this was the part she said carefully, there was nothing preventing me from withdrawing my legal half. 50% of the current balance was mine by the terms of the account. I was entitled to take it. "The question," she said, "is what you want the act of taking it to communicate, and when." "I want to take it before she does," I said. "Then I'd advise doing it on the same day you serve the dissolution paperwork for the company. Not before, not after. Same day. So that the sequence of events is unambiguous. You acted within your legal rights across both fronts simultaneously, not reactively." I understood the logic precisely. She wasn't defending a position, she was establishing one. I set a date. The thing about living in parallel for 2 months is that it changes your relationship with time itself. The days with Isadora existed in one register, familiar, domestic, the long-established rhythm of someone else's habits in the same space as yours, coffee cups in the same place, her particular way of leaving shoes exactly where someone might trip on them, the near-constant hum of her phone on the kitchen counter. The days at the Aldgate flat, the evenings spent moving things in, arranging the rooms, having dinner alone for the first time in years, existed in an entirely different register. Cleaner, more deliberate, the particular quiet of a space that carries only your own history. I wasn't performing sadness when I was with her. I wasn't performing anything. I was simply present in two timelines simultaneously, and one of them was becoming more real by the week. Elliot came over to the Aldgate flat one evening with takeout and a bottle of something sensible. "How much longer?" he asked. 10 days, I said. He nodded. We ate. He didn't ask about Isadora, and I didn't offer. We talked about a property deal he was closing in the Larchwood area and a market analysis I'd been working on. We watched sport. It was, given everything, a very ordinary evening. That ordinariness was, I realized, a preview. This was what my life would look like on the other side. Ordinary in the right ways, quiet in the ways I'd chosen. I should tell you about the business plan specifically, because it matters more than the money. Isadora's vision for Sablecroft Interiors was genuinely good. She had real design ability, a distinctive aesthetic sensibility, and a growing reputation among a certain class of residential clients. What she'd lacked, what I had provided, was the structural architecture of the business itself. The document I'd authored was 47 pages. It included a financial model with 3-year revenue projections, a competitive market analysis, a client acquisition strategy, a pricing framework, and a brand positioning document. It also included what I had titled a network leverage section, which mapped out how relationships in commercial development and structured investment could be accessed to accelerate the business into a higher client tier. She had read the document. She had offered 2 suggestions. Both were good. I had incorporated them. But she had not written it. She had not modeled the financials. She had not built the strategy. When Margaret formalized the IP assignment, I understood what I was doing. Not to destroy the business. She could still run an interior design practice. She had real talent, and she would always have it. But the specific strategic framework I had built for her, the route through the professional network that had generated her most significant income over the last 2 years, that belonged to me. And with it gone, and the network connections withdrawn, and the company formally dissolved, she would be building from a materially weaker position than the one she'd been assuming she occupied. Not from nothing, but from considerably less than she'd planned. I want to be clear about why this felt proportionate rather than vindictive. She had built her plans as though my contributions were permanent. She had placed me in the role of steady, reliable foundation while reserving her real commitment for something else entirely. The structure of what she'd built, personally, professionally, had my work at every load-bearing point. She had said she was building toward Conrad. Fine. She could build toward Conrad without my architecture underneath her. The day before I had scheduled everything, Isadora and I had a completely ordinary evening. We cooked together. She'd bought ingredients for something she'd been meaning to make for weeks, a pasta dish her mother had taught her, one she made about twice a year, and that I had always genuinely liked. The kitchen smelled of garlic and something herbal, and the particular warmth of cooking together in a small space where you know each other's movements. She was in a good mood, easy, relaxed, the specific version of herself that emerged when a professional week had gone well and she wasn't anxious about anything. She talked about a new project she'd been approached about, a boutique hotel in the Harrogate area. Early stages, nothing confirmed, but she was genuinely excited about it. I listened. I set the table. We ate. We drank wine, a good bottle she'd brought back from a trip to see her sister. We talked about her sister, about a film we'd both been meaning to watch, about whether we should take a trip somewhere before summer properly arrived. I said yes, we should plan something. I meant it in the way you can mean something that has nowhere to go. It was a complete statement in the moment we were in. She heard it as ordinary. After dinner, I washed up, and she was on the sofa with her phone, and the candle was burning, that sandalwood smell I'd never named, and the apartment had the quiet, particular weight of an evening that felt like any other. I dried my hands. I looked at the room. I thought, this is the last ordinary night. Not with grief, not with anything I could easily name, just with the clarity of someone reading a final page. The next morning, I waited until she left for a client meeting. 7:40, the one she had across town, the one she always rushed for. The door clicked. I heard the lift. I worked quickly, but without panic. I had a checklist. I had been working from checklists for weeks. The remaining documents and personal items I'd staged in the Aldgate flat's second bedroom were already arranged in labeled bags. I moved them to the car in 4 trips. The books that remained, the financial files, the electronics that were mine. A few pieces of furniture I'd bought for the apartment, receipts retained and filed. I left everything that was hers. I left it exactly as it was. I left a note on the kitchen counter, not long, not performed. It said what was true, that I had made arrangements, that I had moved out, that she should feel free to contact me through my solicitor for any matters that needed formal resolution. I signed it the way you sign a business letter. Then I sent 3 things simultaneously, using the scheduling function I'd set up the previous night. First, the dissolution paperwork for Sablecroft Interiors, delivered to Isadora's email from Margaret's office. Second, a transfer of my legal half of the joint investment account, executed at the bank, £23,500 to my personal account. 50% of the balance at the time of the scheduled transfer, within my legal entitlement as a joint account holder. Third, a letter from Margaret to the Sablecroft Business Bank, notifying them that I had revoked my co-directorship and that the company was in formal dissolution proceedings. The remaining balance in the business account would be addressed in that process. All 3 sent at 9:15. I drove to the Aldgate flat. I made coffee. I sat on the small terrace with the city in the distance and the particular pale blue of a March morning. The air smelled of cold metal and something farther off, stone or water, or just the particular quality of city air before 10 in the morning when it hasn't yet been used. I sat there for a long time without doing anything else. She called at 11:22. I let it ring. She called again at 11:40. The third call came at 12:05, and I answered it. She said my name first, just that, in the particular tone she used when something had genuinely surprised her, when the composure she kept polished had actually cracked. "What is this?" she said. Not a question, a demand for orientation. "It's what it looks like," I said. "The papers from the solicitor, the account, those are both straightforward," I said. "Everything is within my legal rights. The dissolution is procedurally correct. The account transfer is exactly 50%. You'll want to contact the bank about the lease direct debit." A silence. "The lease direct debit," she repeated. "I've canceled the standing order as of today. The lease is in your name. You'll want to arrange your own payments going forward." Another silence, longer this time. "Callum." Her voice had changed quality. Not a demand now. Something else. The sound of someone recalibrating, rereading a situation they thought they understood. "The business plan documents are also mine," I said. "My solicitor will send documentation of the IP ownership. You're welcome to continue operating as a designer under a different name and structure. The company itself is being wound up." "Why are you doing this?" I considered whether to answer. I thought about the hallway, the specific pitch of her voice, the particular flatness that had no conflict in it, no hesitation. "He's always been my backup." "I think you know," I said. She went quiet in a way that told me she did know, or was beginning to.
"The Red Veil pitch," she said, very quietly.
"The development coordinator will tell you they're waiting for your company's status to be clarified. That's accurate."
"You told them?"
"I informed them of a material fact about the company they were considering entering a contract with," I said. "That's entirely appropriate." The silence this time had a different texture. Not shock, something more complicated. A kind of taking stock, the way you might sit with an injury to understand its extent before deciding how to move.
"When did you—" She stopped. "How long have you been planning this?"
I didn't answer that. "Conrad," she said. I waited. It wasn't. She stopped again. Whatever she'd meant to say, it found no landing. There was no version of the sentence that arrived somewhere. "I hope it works out with him," I said. I mean that without sarcasm. She made a sound I didn't have a category for. "I'm going to go now," I said. "Margaret's details are in the letter. Anything that needs formal resolution should go through her." "Callum, take care of yourself, Isadora." I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the small table. The city was still out there. The sky had shifted, more cloud now, the blue becoming white, the kind of spring day that can't decide what it wants to be. I picked up my coffee. It had gone slightly cold, the way coffee does when you've been distracted from it. I drank it anyway. The next 3 weeks were administrative. The dissolution of Sablecroft Interiors proceeded through the standard Companies House process. No trading history, no outstanding liabilities, no third-party investment. As Margaret had predicted, a clean, unremarkable winding up. She handled the paperwork. I signed what needed signing. The company ceased to exist by the last week of the month. The investment account was formally split. The bank required both signatures for a final accounting. Isadora engaged her own solicitor, a process that took several weeks of correspondence, and the split was eventually formalized as agreed. 50% each. My half was in my account, where it had been for 3 weeks by the time the paperwork caught up with it. The apartment was straightforwardly hers. The lease was in her name. There was nothing to negotiate, which was the cleanest part of all of it. She had been paying it on her own for 3 weeks when I heard, through Patricia, that she'd found a flatmate, a friend of a friend who needed a room. Practical solution. I hoped it worked. Patricia called me again 6 weeks after I'd moved out.
"I'm not going to ask for details," she said.
"I just want to know you're all right." "I'm all right," I said. "The Isadora version of events is—" She paused. "It's not my version." "I imagine not." "She knows why," Patricia said. "She hasn't said it directly, but she knows. I've known her 20 years. I know what her face does when she's aware of something she'd rather not be." I thought about the hallway, the particular flatness of her voice, how something can be both completely casual and completely devastating depending on which side of the wall you're standing on. "I don't need her to say it," I said. "No, I don't suppose you do." Patricia asked how the new flat was. I told her it was good, top floor, south-facing. She made a sound of assessment that was purely professional, a designer calculating light and space from 2 words. "Come for dinner sometime," she said. "I will," I said, and I meant it. I want to tell you about the one moment in all of it that came close to something I'd call regret. Not about leaving, not about the legal and financial steps, not about any of the mechanics. It was the flowers. The pale orange roses in the brown paper, set on the counter on the evening her presentation had gone well. The genuine ease of that night, her actually pleased, actually present, actually herself. Whatever private architecture she was building away from me, she was also real in that kitchen. The person I'd lived with for 4 years was a real person, and she had been good company. And there had been actual warmth in the arrangement, even if that warmth had a different value to each of us. I thought about that occasionally, in the first weeks at the Aldgate flat. Not with longing, not with the kind of grief that reopens. Just with the particular awareness that complicated things are complicated, and that someone being willing to use you doesn't mean they felt nothing for you. Those two facts can coexist in the same person. It doesn't change the mathematics. But it's worth knowing that you're not wrong for having felt something genuine, even if the other person had designated you as contingent from the start. That was the last time I thought about it in those terms. The Aldgate flat became, over the following months, genuinely mine. I bought furniture I chose without consulting anyone. I arranged the shelves the way I wanted them. I cooked what I wanted on no particular schedule. I had Aldercroft colleagues over for dinner once, and Elliot twice, and Patricia once, which was slightly strange and also entirely fine. The strangeness faded by dessert. The desk by the south window became where I worked on the project I'd been postponing for 2 years. A proprietary model I'd been developing for volatility analysis in structured credit products. It was a problem I'd been circling for a long time. A gap in how certain instruments were being priced, a specific inefficiency that I could see clearly, but hadn't had the uninterrupted mental space to build around. I worked on it most evenings for 6 months. The flat's silence was useful. The particular absence of someone else's noise, someone else's rhythms occupying the ambient space, it was useful in ways I hadn't anticipated. By the autumn, it was something worth showing people. I showed it to my division head at Aldercroft. He spent 45 minutes with it, and then asked me to present it to the senior partners. I did. The result was a formal offer. A junior partnership role with a profit-sharing arrangement tied to the model's deployment. Calculated conservatively, it represented more in its first year of operation than I'd earned in the previous 4 combined. I accepted on a Tuesday. There's an accounting principle I've always found useful, not as a metaphor, just as a way of thinking about resource allocation. Sunk cost. A sunk cost is a cost that has already been incurred and cannot be recovered. Classical decision theory says you should ignore sunk costs when making forward-looking decisions. What you've already spent is irrelevant to what you should do next. People find this counterintuitive because it feels like it should matter. The time, the money, the effort, the years of it. It feels like those things should count towards something, like you're owed a return on them. You're not. What you're owed is a clear read of the current position and an accurate assessment of what's available to you from here. I'd done 4 years as someone's hedged position. I had been the steady foundation for a plan I hadn't known I was inside. When I finally read the position correctly, I reallocated. That's all of it. The partnership papers were signed on a Tuesday. Elliot took me to dinner. A proper one, the kind with a wine list that runs to several pages and a sommelier who means it. We had something very good. The kind of wine that doesn't taste like anything you can describe, but that you know immediately is different. We talked about the deal he'd closed and the model I'd built, and nothing in particular for a long time, because nothing in particular was all that was needed. He raised his glass. "To reading the position," he said. I raised mine. We drank. The last administrative piece was the closing of the joint investment account. With the balance split and both parties' instructions received, the bank closed the account and sent a final statement to both addresses. Mine arrived at the Aldgate flat on a gray Friday morning. I held the letter for a moment. Account closed. 0 balance. The clean, institutional language of a thing that no longer exists. I filed it. Then I made coffee and sat at the desk by the south window, and the city was out there doing what cities do. The particular endless industry of it, all that movement and transaction, all those positions being opened and closed, All those plans adjusting in real time to information they'd only just received. I opened the model on my laptop. 6 months after I moved out, I was on the tube heading home from a dinner near the Caldwell building when my phone lit up with a number I recognized and hadn't heard from in half a year. I didn't answer it. I watched it ring and stop, ring and stop. Then nothing. No voicemail. I put the phone in my pocket. The tube was warm with the familiar underground warmth that smells like electricity and movement. The car rocked on the track. Someone across the aisle was reading a novel with a very bright cover. A child 2 seats down was asleep, head on a parent's shoulder, completely unbothered. I thought about the partnership, the morning presentation scheduled for the following week, whether I had the ingredients I needed for what I'd been planning to cook on Sunday. The phone didn't light up again. The train pulled into my stop. I got off. There was work to do.
Yeah, it's pretty sweet. I woke up this morning and actually had energy. So I decided to add some more. Look, before Simon gets here, I need to tell you something about him. Oh man, sleep is amazing. Yeah, I'm really bad about going to sleep on time. Like, I have this dumb Apple Watch that I cannot stand. And it constantly tells me, like, at like 10 o'clock, like, hey, asshole, go to bed. And it's almost like your parents telling you to go to bed. You don't want to do it because it told you to. I'm no slave to Apple. You don't tell me when I go to bed. I'm a rebel.